Reforming government from within can present interesting challenges, and joining us now with more insight on that and firsthand experience is Joe Coletti. He is Senior Fellow for the Locke Foundation. And Joe, before we get to your firsthand experience with government reform from within, your general assessment of the Program Evaluation Division in the General Assembly and just how important its work is.
Yeah, I've been a beneficiary of a lot of John Turcotte's and his team's work over the years, whether it was Medicaid back a dozen years ago or while I was working on the government reform with occupational licensing and property that the state owns. So there's a lot of good that they do. Their ideas that they have big ideas to tackle, but effective reforms generally happen at a small scale, and so but they have accomplished a fair amount, especially for the budget they have. Just when you take a look at the overall budget for the state, the rest of us might not notice it as much, but they do good work, and it's been a great service that he's provided.
One of the important things we heard from John Turcotte during his last meeting with the oversight group that works with that division is the importance of having an independent voice, standing aside and being able to say, look, here's what we think, not just what the legislative leaders think. How important is that?
It's extremely important to be able to go back after the law is passed and say, well, how did that work? And in program evaluation, they worked closely with me when I was in state government. They worked closely with the auditor, and they've prompted the General Assembly to try other avenues to evaluate beforehand. They have a measurability service that they now do for agencies to see existing programs, how are they doing, and any new program, how is it going to be measured and be evaluated afterward the fact. So it's an extremely valuable thing, and I wish they had more capability in that the General Assembly asked them to do more, because one of the limitations that they have is that they can only do what the General Assembly has asked them to do.
Now let's switch gears, and I use that word advisedly because the reason you have firsthand experience with this is you worked at one point in the Pat McCrory administration on a project that was specifically dealing with similar ideas, trying to reform government from within, and it was called NC Gear. Tell us what you learned working with NC Gear.
The biggest thing was that a lot of the ideas that we have in the think tanks, people have thought about in-state government. It's really hard to actually get accomplished, and jumping through all the hoops. And then you have a lot of inertia that is in place, even if something passes legislation, to be able to actually implement it and get it done. And so we ended up, we had a broad scope at NC Gear to take a look at all of state government. We brought in outside consultants. And poured through what do other states doing and what works and what doesn't work within state government. We ended up cutting. We had about a 400-page report from the consultants, and we ended up with about 20 recommendations. And fortunately, about 14 of those were passed and implemented. But kind of like with program evaluation, some of the biggest ideas that we had got stymied in conflicting views of the data. That might sound familiar to folks now. And some of the other things were ideas that we thought we had, and some of those took off, like combining the receipts-driven parts of the zoos and the aquariums that used to be in what is now the Division of Environmental Quality with the rest of cultural resources. So that everybody's looking at the same thing. And the biggest stumbling block on that one was actually which appropriations subcommittee it went through. And so you learn that there are all kinds of, you never know where the challenge is going to come from when trying to reform state government.
After having gone through that process, did it sour you on government reform, or did it just say to you, you've got to do it right and you have to know how to approach it?
It gave me both of those. that there's a lot to be able to make something happen appropriately. And there are so many things because of the structure of government and the nature of funding, especially how much of that funding comes from the federal government, actually led me out of government and out of policy work for about a year and a half before coming back to the Locke Foundation. So
you need a detox.
I really did, yeah.
So moving forward, now back in your role as a senior fellow looking at tax and policy issues and to some extent reforms of the way government does its operations, what types of things from your experience with NC Gear and watching what the Program Evaluation Division does, what kinds of things does that tell you about how reformers should approach their work?
Well, one of the things that we recommended at NC Gear that's in process and that requires a little bit of money up front is a better way to account for the money and everything else that the state government has. And that's called an enterprise resource planning software. There's money and it's at the university system, the K-12 system, and the community colleges in addition to general state government. There's going to be 4 systems in place plus transportation. But you need to be able to answer those basic questions about how do we manage and what do things cost and what are we getting for our money. And you have to know those questions a lot of times going into it so that you can answer those questions when you're coming out of it. Because too many government programs are just based on how many people, how much money, without consideration of what do we get for the money. And fortunately, there is some effort to reform that, but there's not nearly enough data, and the data that does exist often conflicts, and so that leaves us with debates that go back to the conflict of visions that Thomas Sowell often talked about.